World War I was the first time that aircraft were used on a large scale. Tethered observation balloons had already been employed in several wars, and would be used extensively for artillery spotting. Germany employed Zeppelins for reconnaissance over the North Sea and Baltic, and also for strategic bombing raids over Britain and the Eastern Front. Aeroplanes were just coming into military use at the outset of the war. Initially, they were used mostly for reconnaissance. Pilots and engineers learned from experience, leading to the development of many specialized types, including fighters, bombers, and ground attack aeroplanes. Ace fighter pilots were portrayed as modern knights, and many became popular heroes. The war also saw the appointment of high-ranking officers to direct the belligerent nation's air war effort. While the impact of aircraft on the course of war was mainly tactical rather than strategic, most important being direct cooperation with ground forces, the first steps in the strategic roles of aircraft in future wars was also foreshadowed. The early years of war. At the start of the war, there was some debate over the usefulness of aircraft in warfare. Many senior officers, in particular, remained skeptical. However, the initial campaigns of 1914 proved that cavalry could no longer provide the reconnaissance expected by their generals. In the face of the greatly increased firepower of 20th-century armies, and it was quickly realized that aircraft could at least locate the enemy, even if early air reconnaissance was hampered by the newness of the techniques involved. Early skepticism and low expectations quickly turned to unrealistic demands beyond the capabilities of the primitive aircraft available. Even so, air reconnaissance played a critical role in the War of Movement of 1914, especially in helping the Allies halt the German invasion of France. On the 22nd of August 1914, British Captain L.E.O. Charlton and Lieutenant V.H.N. Wadham reported German General Alexander von Kluck's army was preparing to surround the BEF, contradicting all other intelligence. The British High Command took note of the report and started to withdraw toward Mons, saving the lives of 100,000 soldiers. Later, during the First Battle of the Marne, observation aircraft discovered weak points and exposed flanks in the German lines, allowing the Allies to take advantage of them. In Germany, the great successes of the early Zeppelin airships had largely overshadowed the importance of heavier-than-air aircraft. Out of a paper strength of about 230 aircraft belonging to the Army in August 1914, only 180 or so were of any use. The French military aviation exercises of 1911, 1912, and 1913 had pioneered cooperation with the cavalry and artillery, but the momentum was, if anything, slacking. Great Britain had started late, and initially relied largely on the French aircraft industry, especially for aircraft engines. The initial British contribution to the total Allied air war effort in August 1914 was 3 squadrons with about 30 serviceable machines. The American Army and Navy air services were hopelessly behind, even in 1917, when the United States entered the war. They were to be almost totally dependent on the French and British aircraft industries for combat aircraft. The Germans' great air coup of 1914 was at the Battle of Tannenberg in East Prussia, where an unexpected Russian attack was reported by Lieutenants Cantor and Mertens, resulting in the Russians being forced to withdraw. Early Western Front reconnaissance duties. By the end of 1914, the line between the Germans and the Allies stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. The initial War of Movement largely ceased, and the front became static. 3 main functions of short-range reconnaissance squadrons had emerged by March 1915. The first was photographic reconnaissance, building up a complete mosaic map of the enemy trench system. The first air cameras used glass plates. Artillery spotting enabled the ranging of artillery on targets invisible to the gunners. Radio telephony was not yet practical from an aircraft, so communication was a problem. By March 1915, a two-seater on artillery observation duties was typically equipped with a primitive radio transmitter transmitting using Morse code, but had no receiver. The artillery battery signaled to the aircraft by laying strips of white cloth on the ground in prearranged patterns. Observation duties were shared with the tethered balloons, which could communicate directly with their batteries by field telephone, but were far less flexible in locating targets and reporting the fall of shot. Contact patrol work attempted to follow the course of a battle by communicating with advancing infantry while flying over the battlefield. The technology of the period did not permit radio contact, while methods of signaling were necessarily crude, including dropping messages from the aircraft. Soldiers were initially reluctant to reveal their positions to aircraft, as they found distinguishing between friend and foe problematic. Reconnaissance flying, like all kinds, was a hazardous business. In April 1917, the worst month for the entire war for the RFC, the average life expectancy of a British pilot on the Western Front was 93 flying hours. Early bombing efforts. Typical 1914 aircraft could carry only very small bomb loads. The bombs themselves, and their stowage, were still very elementary, and effective bomb sights were still to be developed. Nonetheless, the beginnings of strategic and tactical bombing date from the earliest days of the war. Notable are the raids by the RNAS on the German airship sheds at Düsseldorf, Cologne and Friedrichshafen in September, October and November 1914, as well as the formation of the Brieftaube-Abteilung Ostende, which mounted the first token raid over the English Channel in December. The dawn of air combat. As Dixon had predicted, initially air combat was extremely rare, and definitely subordinate to reconnaissance. There are even stories of the crew of rival reconnaissance aircraft exchanging nothing more belligerent than smiles and waves. This soon progressed to throwing grenades, and other objects, even grappling hooks. The first aircraft brought down by another was an Austrian reconnaissance aircraft rammed on 8 September 1914 by Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov in Galicia in the Eastern Front. Both planes crashed as the result of the attack, killing all occupants. Eventually pilots began firing handheld firearms at enemy aircraft. However, pistols were too inaccurate and the single-shot rifles too unlikely to score a hit. On October 5, 1914, French pilot Louis Queneau opened fire on a German aircraft with a machine gun for the first time, and the era of air combat was underway as more and more aircraft were fitted with machine guns. Evolution of fighter aircraft. The pusher solution as early as 1912. Designers at the British firm Vickers were experimenting with machine gun carrying aircraft. The first concrete result was the Vickers experimental fighting biplane 1, which featured at the 1913 Aero Show in London, and appeared in developed form as the FB-5 in February 1915. This pioneering fighter, like the Royal Aircraft Factory FE-2B and the Airco DH-1, was a pusher type. This provided an optimal machine gun position, from which the gun could be fired directly forward without an obstructing propeller, and reloaded and cleared in flight. An important drawback was that pusher designs tended to have an inferior performance to tractor types with the same engine power because of the extra drag created by the struts and rigging necessary to carry the tail unit. The FE-2D, a more powerful version of the FE-2B, remained a formidable opponent well into 1917, when pusher fighters were already obsolete. They were simply too slow to catch their quarry. Machine gun synchronization. The forward-firing gun of a pusher gun carrier provided some offensive capability. The mounting of a machine gun firing to the rear from a two-seater tractor aircraft gave defensive capability. There was an obvious need for some means to fire a machine gun forward from a tractor aircraft, especially from one of the small, light, Scout aircraft, adapted from pre-war races, that were to perform most air combat duties for the rest of the war. It would seem most natural to place the gun between the pilot and the propeller, firing in the direct line of flight, so that the gun could be aimed by aiming the aircraft. It was also important that the breech of the weapon be readily accessible to the pilot, so that he could clear the jams and stoppages to which early machine guns were prone. However, this presented an obvious problem. A percentage of bullets fired free through a revolving propeller will strike the blades, with predictable results. Early experiments with synchronized machine guns had been carried out in several countries before the war. Franz Schneider, then working for Newport in France but later working for LVG in Germany, patented a synchronization gear on 15 July 1913. An early Russian gear was designed by a Lieutenant Poplavko. The Edwards brothers in England designed the first British example, and the Moran-Saulnier Company were also working on the problem in 1914. All these early experiments failed to attract official attention, partly due to official inertia, and partly due to the terrifying results of failures of these early synchronizing gears, which included dangerously ricocheting bullets as well as disintegrating propellers. The Lewis guns, used on many early Allied aircraft, proved next to impossible to successfully synchronize due to its open-bolt firing cycle. In an open-bolt firing cycle, it is impossible to predict the exact time any given round will fire. A problematic characteristic in a weapon one is attempting to fire between the spinning blades of a propeller. Photographs of fuselage-mounted Lewis guns aimed directly ahead on RNAS aircraft, and looking as if they should be synchronized, as with some of the Bristol Scouts, were probably in fact free-firing. Hardly a satisfactory solution. The Maxim guns used by both the Allies and Germany had a closed-bolt firing cycle that started with a bullet already in the breech and the breech closed. So the firing of the bullet was the next step in the cycle. This meant that the exact instant the round would be fired could be predicted, making these weapons considerably easier to synchronize. The standard French light machine guns, the Hotchkiss, was also most unamenable to synchronization due to rounds hanging fire. The Moran-Saulnier Company designed a safety backup in the form of deflector blades, complete with metal tie bars extending outwards from the propeller hub for bracing, fitted to the rear surfaces of a propeller at the radial point where they would be struck by a bullet. Roland Garros tried out this system in a Moran-Saulnier L in April 1915. He managed to score several kills, although it proved to be an inadequate and dangerous solution. Garros eventually was forced by engine failure to land behind enemy lines, and he and his secret weapon were captured by the Germans. Famously, the German High Command passed Garros captured Moran to the Fokker Company, who already produced Moran-type monoplanes for the German Air Service, with orders to copy the design. The deflector system was totally unsuitable for the steel-jacketed German ammunition, so that the Fokker engineers were forced to revisit the synchronization idea, resulting in the Eindecker fighter series. Crude as these little monoplanes were, they produced a period of German air superiority, known as the Fokker Scourge, by the Allies. The psychological effect exceeded the material. The Allies had up to now been more or less unchallenged in the air, and the vulnerability of their older reconnaissance aircraft, especially the British BE-2 and French Farman pushers, came as a very nasty shock. Another method used at this time to fire a machine gun forward from a tractor design was to mount the gun to fire above the propeller arc. This required the gun to be mounted on the top wing of biplanes and be mounted on complicated drag-inducing structures in monoplanes. Reaching the gun so that drums or belts could be changed, or jams cleared, presented problems even when the gun could be mounted relatively close to the pilot. Eventually the excellent Foster mounting became more or less the standard way of mounting a Lewis gun in this position in the RFC. This allowed the gun to slide backward for drum changing, and also to be fired at an upward angle, a very effective way of attacking an enemy from the blind spot under its tail. This type of mounting was still only possible for a biplane with a top wing positioned near the apex of the propeller's arc. It put considerable strain on the fragile wing structures of the period, and it was less rigid than a gun mounting on the fuselage, producing a greater scatter of bullets, especially at anything but very short range. The earliest versions of the Bristol Scout to see aerial combat duty in 1915, the Scout C, had Lewis gun mounts in RNAS service that sometimes were elevated above the propeller arc, and sometimes firing directly through the propeller arc without synchronization. During the spring and summer of 1915, Captain Lano Hawker of the Royal Flying Corps, however, had mounted his Lewis gun just forward of the cockpit to fire forwards and outwards on the left side of his aircraft's fuselage at about a 30 degrees horizontal angle. On the 25th of July 1915, Captain Hawker flew his Scout C, bearing RFC serial number 1611 against several two-seat German observation aircraft of the Flieger Truppe, and managed to defeat 3 of them in aerial engagements to earn the first Victoria Cross awarded to a British aviator. 1915. The Fokker Scourge. The first purpose-designed fighter aircraft included the British Vickers FB-5, and machine guns were also fitted to several French types, such as the Moran Saulnier L and N. Initially, the German air service lagged behind the Allies in this respect, but this was soon to change dramatically. In July 1915, the Fokker EI, the first aircraft to enter service with her synchronization gear, which enabled a machine gun to fire through the arc of the propeller without striking its blades, became operational. This gave an important advantage over other contemporary fighter aircraft. This aircraft and its immediate successors, collectively known as the Eindecker, for the first time supplied an effective equivalent to Allied fighters. 2 German military aviators, Lieutenants Otto Parshaw and Kurt Windgens, worked for the Fokker firm during the spring of 1915, demonstrating the revolutionary feature of the forward-firing synchronized machine gun to the embryonic force of Flieger Truppe force pilots of the German Empire. The first successful engagement involving a synchronized gun-armed aircraft occurred on the afternoon of July 1, 1915, to the east of Lunéville, France, when Lieutenant Kurt Windgens, one of the pilots selected by Fokker to demonstrate the small series of 5 Eindecker prototype aircraft, forced down a French Moran Saulnier Parasol 2-seat observation monoplane behind Allied lines with his Fokker M5K MG Eindecker production prototype aircraft, carrying the Adflag military serial number E515. Some 200 shots from the synchronized Parabellum MG-14 machine gun on Windgens' aircraft had hit the Gnome Lambda rotary engine of the Moran Parasol, forcing it to land safely in Allied territory. By late 1915, the Germans had achieved air superiority, restricting Allied access to the vital intelligence derived from continual aerial reconnaissance more dangerous to acquire. In particular, the defenselessness of Allied reconnaissance types was exposed. The first German ace pilots, notably Maxim Guns, had begun their careers. The number of actual Allied casualties involved was for various reasons very small compared with the intensive air fighting of 1917-18. The deployment of the Eindeckers was less than overwhelming. The new type was issued in 1s and 2s to existing reconnaissance squadrons, and it was to be nearly a year before the Germans were to follow the British in establishing specialist fighter squadrons. The Eindecker was also, in spite of its advanced armament, by no means an outstanding aircraft, being closely based on the pre-war Moran Saulnier H, although it did feature a steel tubing fuselage framework instead of the wooden fuselage components of the French aircraft. Nonetheless, The impact on morale of the fact that the Germans were effectively fighting back in the air created a major scandal in the British Parliament and press. The ascendancy of the Eindecker also contributed to the surprise the Germans were able to achieve at the start of the Battle of Verdun, because the French reconnaissance aircraft failed to provide their usual cover of the German positions. Fortunately for the Allies, two new British fighters that were a match for the Fokker, the Fe-2B and the Dh-2, were already in production. These were both pushers, and could fire forwards without gun synchronization. The Fe-2B reached the front in September 1915, and the Dh-2 in the following February. On the French front, the tiny Nieuport 11, a tractor biplane with a forward-firing gun mounted on the top wing outside the arc of the propeller, also proved more than a match for the German fighter when it entered service in January 1916. With these new types, the Allies re-established air superiority in time for the Battle of the Somme, and the Fokker Scourge was over. The Fokker E-3, Echo Dh-2 and Nieuport 11 were the very first in a long line of single-seat fighter aircraft used by both sides during the war. Very quickly it became clear the primary role of fighters would be attacking enemy two-seaters, which were becoming increasingly important as sources of reconnaissance and artillery observation, while also escorting and defending friendly two-seaters from enemy fighters. Fighters were also used to attack enemy observation balloons, strafe enemy ground targets, and defend friendly airspace from enemy bombers. Almost all the fighters in service with both sides, with the exception of the Fokker's steel tube fuselaged airframes, continued to use wood as the basic structural material, with fabric-covered wings relying on external wire bracing. However, the first practical all-metal aircraft was produced by Hugo Junkers, who also used a cantilever wing structure with a metal covering. The first flight tests of the initial flight demonstrator of this technology, the Junkers J-1 monoplane, took place at the end of 1915, heralding the future of aircraft structural design.